Some betrayals cut deeper than knives. When love is twisted with lust, manipulation, and greed, even the sanctity of marriage can turn into a death sentence. This is the chilling true story of Pamela Smart, the young wife who orchestrated her husband's brutal murder by seducing teenagers and turning them into weapons of her will. Pamela and Woja Smart was born on August 16, 1967, in Coral Gables, Florida. Her family later moved to New Hampshire, where she grew up as a popular, bright student with a passion for broadcasting. In college, she met Greg Smart, a tall, handsome, and fun-loving young man who shared her adventurous streak. The two quickly fell in love, and in 1989, Pamela and Greg married in a lavish wedding that symbolized a perfect start to their fairy tale romance. But beneath the wedding smiles and the suburban dream, cracks were already forming. Greg worked long hours, began using drugs occasionally, and Pamela felt emotionally neglected. Meanwhile, Pamela had started working as a media coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire, a job that gave her access to students and the perfect cover for what was about to unfold. At school, Pamela met 15-year-old Billy Flynn, a sophomore with boyish charm and a troubled background. Flynn was impressionable, insecure, and looking for affection. Pamela, nearly 23 at the time, showered him with attention, making him feel seen and important. Soon, the relationship turned physical. Pamela seduced Billy, and the two began a secret sexual affair. But Pamela wasn't content with just a fling. She started confiding in Billy about how unhappy she was in her marriage. She complained about Greg, telling Billy that divorce wasn't an option because she would lose her beloved dog, her house, and the financial security she had worked for. In her narrative, Greg was the obstacle standing between them and their true love. Her solution, murder. Pamela began planting the idea in Billy's mind that the only way they could truly be together was if Greg were gone. She manipulated him emotionally, painting herself as the victim of a loveless, controlling marriage. For a 15-year-old, deeply infatuated and eager to please, the idea of killing Greg became twisted into an act of devotion. Billy wasn't alone. Pamela involved his friends, 16-year-old Patrick Randall, 17-year-old J.R. Lattime Jr., and 18-year-old Raymond Fowler. Together, under Pamela's influence, they began planning Greg's murder. Pamela provided details about Greg's routine and encouraged them to make it look like a robbery. On May 1, 1990, the plan was set into motion. That evening, Greg Smart returned home from work to the condominium he shared with Pamela in Derry, New Hampshire. Inside, waiting for him were Billy Flynn and Patrick Randall, armed and ready. As Greg entered the home, he was ambushed. Patrick forced him to kneel while Billy held a gun to his head. Without hesitation, Billy pulled the trigger. Greg was shot execution-style in the head, dying instantly. Pamela came home later that night and discovered the scene. She called the police, hysterically claiming her husband had been killed in a burglary gone wrong. But detectives quickly became suspicious. Something about her demeanor, her inconsistencies, and the lack of forced entry didn't add up. In the weeks that followed, whispers began circulating at Winnicott High School. Students spoke about Pamela's affair with Billy Flynn and her possible involvement in Greg's death. Police leaned on the teenage accomplices, and soon, cracks began to form in their loyalty. The breakthrough came when Cecilia Pierce, a student intern and confidant of Pamela, agreed to wear a wire. Pamela confided in her about the murder, making incriminating statements that confirmed her involvement. When confronted, the teenage boys folded under pressure. Billy Flynn confessed to pulling the trigger but made it clear he acted under Pamela's manipulation. Patrick Randall confirmed the plan, while J.R. Lattime admitted to providing the getaway car. Pamela Smart was arrested on August 1, 1990. The trial of Pamela Smart began in March 1991 and quickly became a national sensation. It was one of the first high-profile court cases to be broadcast on live television, capturing the attention of millions across America. Prosecutors painted Pamela as the mastermind, a manipulative seductress who exploited a teenager's infatuation to achieve her goal. They argued that she orchestrated every detail of the crime, from the motive to the execution. The defense tried to downplay her role, suggesting that Billy Flynn acted independently. But the evidence was overwhelming. Taped conversations, testimonies from the teenage accomplices, and the clear pattern of manipulation. On March 22, 1991, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. Pamela Smart was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence she continues to serve to this day at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, not only for the crime itself but for its cultural impact. It was the first televised trial that turned into a national media event, a precursor to cases like O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony. Her story inspired countless books, documentaries, and even the 1995 film To Die For, starring Nicole Kidman as a character based on Pamela. To this day, Pamela maintains her innocence, claiming she never intended for Greg to be killed. But the weight of evidence, and the chilling testimony of the boys she manipulated, continues to haunt her legacy. The murder of Greg Smart wasn't the act of a cold stranger or a violent intruder. It was orchestrated by the one person he should have been able to trust with his life: his wife. Pamela Smart's betrayal remains one of the most shocking examples of how lust, greed, and manipulation can turn love into a weapon. What makes this case unforgettable isn't just the brutality of the crime, but the age of those involved. Teenagers, still children themselves, were seduced, manipulated, and transformed into killers, all in the name of a woman's selfish desires. Pamela Smart wanted freedom and wealth, but in the end, she earned only a life sentence and the title of one of America's most manipulative killers. They say the greatest betrayals do not come from strangers. They come from the ones you share your home with, the ones you love and trust, the ones who hand you a glass of water or pass you a pill when your head aches. In the summer of 1986, in Auburn, Washington, that betrayal took a form so cold, so calculated, it would not only claim the life of a husband but also reach into the wider community, killing an innocent bystander. At the center of it all was Stella Nickell, a wife who poisoned for profit, and a story that would shake America's faith in the products sitting on its pharmacy shelves. Stella Mauden Nickell seemed, on the surface, like just another suburban wife. She had grown up restless and dissatisfied, often dreaming of more than her modest life could provide. By her 40s, she was living with her husband, Bruce Nickell, a heavy equipment operator who had once battled alcoholism but had rebuilt a sober, steady life. Bruce was well-liked, kind, hardworking, and proud of his recovery. To those around them, the couple looked stable. But Stella saw things differently. She resented Bruce's quiet lifestyle, found him boring, and often confided to friends that she felt trapped. Beneath this dissatisfaction was another motive: money. Stella had taken out life insurance policies on Bruce totaling $76,000, with an added clause doubling the payout if his death was deemed accidental. To her, Bruce alive was worth little, but Bruce dead was the key to financial freedom and the life she craved. Her inspiration came from one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history: the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders, where 7 people died after ingesting cyanide-laced Tylenol. While the nation recoiled in horror, Stella studied the case carefully. She checked out library books about poisons and forensic detection, leaving behind fingerprints on the very pages describing cyanide. She learned how swiftly it killed, how difficult it was to detect, and how, if delivered through a common medication capsule, it could be mistaken for a tragic accident. In June 1986, Stella put her plan into motion. She opened Bruce's Excedrin capsules, filled them with cyanide, and carefully resealed them. On June 5th, Bruce complained of a headache. Stella handed him the tainted medication. Within minutes, Bruce collapsed, seizing violently. He was rushed to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, but it was too late. At just 52 years old, Bruce Nickell was dead. Doctors listed emphysema as the cause, never suspecting poison. Stella had pulled off the perfect crime, or so she thought. But Stella faced a problem. Bruce's death certificate did not classify it as accidental. Without that, she couldn't trigger the double indemnity clause in the insurance. Her greed demanded more, and so she devised a chilling escalation. If one death couldn't convince the authorities, perhaps several would. Stella went to local stores, purchased additional bottles of Excedrin, laced them with cyanide, and quietly returned them to the shelves. It didn't take long for tragedy to strike again. On June 11, 1986, 40-year-old Sue Snow, a mother of two and a bank manager in Auburn, woke up with a headache. She reached for a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin, swallowed the capsules, and soon after collapsed in her bathroom. Her 15-year-old daughter, Haley, found her unconscious on the floor. Sue was rushed to the hospital, but like Bruce, she could not be saved. This time, doctors suspected something unusual. An autopsy revealed cyanide in her system. Authorities quickly tested the capsules from her home, confirming the unthinkable. Someone had tampered with the medication. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. News broke that contaminated Excedrin was on store shelves. Supermarkets pulled products, families panicked, and the FBI was called in. It looked like another Tylenol-style tampering case. Random, terrifying, and potentially widespread. Then Stella stepped into the spotlight. She contacted authorities, claiming that her husband had also used Excedrin before his sudden death just days earlier. She presented Bruce's pill bottles, pushing investigators to test them. When cyanide was confirmed, Bruce's case was reclassified as a poisoning. Stella had achieved what she wanted. Bruce's death was now officially linked to a product tampering scare, making it accidental and unlocking the life insurance payout. But Stella's eagerness to connect Bruce's death to the Excedrin scare also drew suspicion. Investigators began digging deeper. Forensic analysis revealed that the cyanide in the Snow and Nickell cases contained unusual chemical markers. Green crystals from an algae control product. Tracing purchases, agents discovered that Stella had bought several bottles of that very product from a local store. The investigation then turned to her library records. Fingerprints matched to Stella appeared on books about poisons and homicide investigations. It was damning evidence, suggesting premeditation. The most devastating blow came from her own daughter, Cynthia. Under questioning, Cynthia revealed that Stella had spoken openly about wanting Bruce dead, even trying to enlist Cynthia's help in tampering with his motorcycle to cause an accident. Cynthia also recalled her mother discussing poisons and her fixation on insurance money. Though Stella's defense tried to paint Cynthia as unreliable, the testimony aligned with the growing mountain of evidence. On December 9, 1987, Stella Nickell was arrested. She was charged not only with the death of her husband, Bruce, but also with the death of Sue Snow, the innocent bystander who had swallowed one of her tainted capsules. The trial in 1988 captivated the nation. Prosecutors portrayed Stella as greedy and cold, willing to sacrifice not only her husband, but also strangers to secure money. The defense insisted she was being framed, even suggesting her daughter had motives to lie. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 5 days before finding Stella Nickell guilty on 5 counts, including product tampering that resulted in death. She was sentenced to 90 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge called her crimes horrifying in their calculated indifference to human life. She became the first person convicted under the federal product tampering law passed after the Tylenol murders. For the families of Bruce Nickell and Sue Snow, the verdict brought some justice, but no closure. Bruce had been betrayed by the very woman he trusted most. Sue Snow, a stranger with no connection to Stella, had become collateral damage in one woman's pursuit of greed. Today, Stella Nickell remains in prison, still proclaiming her innocence despite the damning trail of evidence. Her case stands as one of the darkest intersections of domestic betrayal and public terror. A reminder that sometimes the gravest danger doesn't come from unknown predators or shadowy figures, but from the hand that passes you a pill with a smile. In the end, Stella didn't just murder her husband. She shattered the fragile trust every consumer places in the simplest acts of daily life. And for that, she will forever be remembered as the woman who poisoned not only her spouse, but an entire community's sense of safety. The vows were spoken, the promises made. Till death do us part. But for Judias Benoano, known later as the Black Widow, death wasn't a vow, it was a business plan. Judy Benuano was born in 1943 in Quanah, Texas, into a life marked by hardship. She grew up in foster care and later claimed her childhood was filled with abuse, neglect, and abandonment. From an early age, she cultivated toughness, self-reliance, and, some say, a cold detachment from those around her. To the outside world, she seemed like a determined woman who wanted stability and family. But beneath that exterior was a ruthless mind that saw relationships not as bonds of love, but as opportunities. By the late 1960s, Judy had moved to Florida. It was there that she married a man named James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant and Vietnam veteran. To friends and neighbors, they seemed like a perfect military family. Judy was the supportive wife, and together they had children and a quiet suburban life. But behind that domestic image was the seed of something far darker. In 1971, after returning from his military service, James Goodyear suddenly fell ill. At first, it looked like exhaustion or a flu-like illness. Nausea, weakness, unexplained pain. Doctors were baffled. His health declined steadily, and within months he was dead. Judy mourned publicly, appearing as the grieving widow. But shortly after his death, insurance checks began rolling in. Judy had taken out multiple life insurance policies on her husband. She collected the money, moved on with her life, and showed little sign of lingering grief. It might have ended there, one tragic death explained away by mystery illness. But the deaths around Judy didn't stop. In 1973, Judy's boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris, moved in with her in Colorado. Like James before him, Bobby began to experience sudden illness, strange symptoms that worsened without explanation. By 1978, Bobby too was dead. Once again, Judy collected insurance money. But Judy's greed was not limited to romantic partners. In 1979, her own son, Michael, a young Army recruit, returned home from service. Soon after arriving, he mysteriously developed severe stomach pains, muscle weakness, and confusion. Doctors later discovered he had been poisoned with arsenic, the same poison suspected in her earlier cases. Michael survived, but the poison left him permanently disabled, needing braces and later a special device to walk. Judy appeared to take care of him. In reality, she was waiting. In 1980, Judy took Michael out in a canoe on a Florida river. The boat capsized, and Michael, weakened and unable to swim because of his leg braces, drowned. It was presented as a tragic accident, a disabled young man losing his life in an unfortunate mishap. Judy, once again, collected on insurance money she had taken out in his name. By now, the pattern was undeniable, but authorities hadn't fully pieced it together. Judy had woven a chilling web of lies, manipulation, and calculated murders, and she wasn't finished. By the early 1980s, investigators began to notice a disturbing trail. Too many people close to Judy had died under suspicious circumstances, and too often she profited from their deaths. The real breakthrough came when medical examiners exhumed the bodies of James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris. Toxicology tests revealed arsenic poisoning. Suddenly, the illnesses that had baffled doctors years earlier made sense. They weren't illnesses at all. They were deliberate, cold-blooded murders. Authorities also re-examined the death of Michael. They realized his drowning wasn't just an accident. It was the final act in a cruel scheme. Judy had poisoned him until he was disabled, then ensured he drowned in a situation he couldn't possibly escape. The case shocked investigators. Here was a woman who had not only murdered her husband and lover, but had targeted her own son, all for insurance payouts. The nickname given to her by the press captured the essence of her crimes: the Black Widow. In 1983, Judy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the death of her son Michael, and with additional charges related to the arsenic poisonings of her husband and boyfriend. The trial was chilling. Prosecutors laid out her pattern of behavior: the life insurance policies, the sudden mysterious illnesses, the repeated deaths, and the financial gain. Witnesses described her as cold, detached, and emotionless, more concerned about her insurance money than the lives lost. The jury heard how Michael, a disabled veteran, had no chance to survive the canoe accident. They listened to testimony about arsenic, a poison that leaves victims writhing in agony, slowly destroying their bodies. They saw a portrait of a woman willing to sacrifice anyone, husband, lover, even her own child, for greed. In 1984, Judy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for the murder of Michael. She was also given lengthy prison sentences for the poisonings of James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris. Her case became one of the most infamous examples of female serial killers in America, because her crimes weren't driven by rage or passion, but by cold calculation. Judy spent 13 years on death row in Florida. During her time in prison, she continued to maintain her innocence, often presenting herself as a victim of circumstance. But appeals after appeals were denied. On March 30, 1998, Judy Benuano was executed in Florida's electric chair. She became the first woman executed in the state since 1848, and only the third woman executed in the U.S. since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. The families of her victims never found true closure, but many said justice had finally been served. Judy left behind a legacy of horror, a woman who wore the mask of a loving wife and mother, but underneath was a predator who saw human lives as nothing more than dollar signs. Judy Benuano's story is a chilling reminder that evil can thrive in the most familiar places. She wasn't a stranger in the dark, but a wife, a mother, a caregiver. And yet, for those who loved her, every embrace was a betrayal waiting to unfold. In the quiet suburbs of Florida, behind the doors of an ordinary home, she turned family into prey and love into a death sentence. They called her Hell's Belle. She looked like an ordinary farm widow in the heartland of America, but her farm would become a graveyard. Behind the fences and barns of her Indiana homestead, Belle Gunness turned the promise of love into a trap of death. Belle Gunness was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Storset in 1859, in a small town in Norway. She grew up poor, the daughter of struggling farmers, and learned from an early age that survival required toughness, cunning, and sacrifice. In 1881, at the age of 22, she immigrated to the United States in search of the American dream. Like many immigrants, she wanted a new life, but Belle's version of the dream wasn't about hard work and opportunity. It was about greed, manipulation, and, eventually, murder. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 200 pounds, Belle was physically intimidating. Neighbors described her as hardworking and practical, but also cold and calculating. She lacked warmth and charm, yet she managed to lure in men by offering them what they craved most: the promise of companionship, marriage, and financial stability. Belle's first marriage was to Mads Sorensen in Chicago. The couple opened a candy store, but the business quickly failed. Then, mysteriously, their home and store caught fire. Insurance money came to the rescue, and Belle profited. Not long after, Mads himself died suddenly on July 30th, 1900. The cause was initially ruled as heart failure, but suspicions later revealed a more sinister twist. Belle had convinced her husband to take out 2 separate life insurance policies, and, coincidentally, both were active on the very same day he died. The payout was massive. With the money, Belle purchased a farm in La Porte, Indiana. This quiet, rural land would become the infamous stage for one of America's earliest serial murder stories. Belle wasted no time in setting up her new life. She married a second man, Peter Gunness, a butcher. Within a week of their marriage, tragedy struck. Peter's infant daughter died under Belle's care. A few months later, Peter himself died in a bizarre accident. Belle claimed a meat grinder had fallen on his head. Once again, insurance money flowed into Belle's pockets. Locals began to whisper, but Belle's outward appearance as a grieving widow kept suspicion at bay. But Belle's greed went beyond her husband's. She began posting advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, targeting lonely immigrant men looking for love. Her ads promised a future of shared prosperity on her Indiana farm. She asked them to bring their savings, promising marriage, a fresh start, and partnership. Dozens of men responded. They traveled hundreds of miles to meet her, often carrying their life savings. And then they disappeared. Families wrote letters, but Belle claimed the men had simply left, moved west, or abandoned her. In reality, Belle had turned her farm into a slaughterhouse. Belle's methods were disturbingly consistent. When suitors arrived, she would charm them just enough to earn their trust. After dinner, she often drugged their food, incapacitating them. Then, with cold efficiency, she would bludgeon them to death or slit their throats. Their bodies were dragged into her cellar, where she dismembered them. Finally, she buried the remains in shallow graves around her farm, often sprinkling quicklime to mask the smell. Over time, Belle accumulated land, money, and valuables. Estimates suggest she may have murdered more than 40 people, though the exact number remains unknown. Each grave represented another victim of her insatiable greed. For years, Belle's secrets remained hidden beneath the soil of her farm. But by 1908, her world began to collapse. One suitor, Andrew Helgelian from South Dakota, disappeared after traveling to meet Belle. His brother, suspicious of the vague letters Belle sent, began investigating. He demanded answers, writing to Belle and eventually traveling to La Porte to confront her. But before he could uncover the truth, Belle's farm burned to the ground on April 28, 1908. Inside the charred remains of the farmhouse, authorities found the bodies of Belle's 3 foster children and the decapitated body of a woman presumed to be Belle herself. However, many noted the corpse didn't match Belle's size or build. Some speculated Belle had staged her own death, murdering another woman to fake her demise. As investigators combed through the ruins of her farm, they unearthed something far more horrifying. Dozens of human remains buried across the property. Skeletons, dismembered torsos, and skulls with blunt force trauma littered the soil. It was a mass graveyard. The newspapers dubbed it the murder farm. Belle Gunness' reputation transformed overnight from grieving widow to one of America's most terrifying female serial killers. Belle's motive was clear: greed. Each victim represented another payday through life insurance, stolen savings, or property deeds. But greed alone doesn't explain the sheer scale of her crimes. Many experts believe Belle also relished the control and power. She was a woman in a society dominated by men, and yet she manipulated, deceived, and destroyed them at will. She turned suitors into prey, their love and trust twisted into a death sentence. Her killings also displayed a chilling practicality. She chose methods that were quick, efficient, and left her with maximum profit. There was no passion, no spur-of-the-moment rage, only cold, methodical murder. The discovery of Belle's farm horrified the nation. Neighbors who once saw her as a hardworking widow now realized they had lived next to a predator. Families across the Midwest grieved as they learned their missing loved ones had likely been lured to La Porte and never returned. The biggest mystery remains. Did Belle Gunness really die in that farmhouse fire? Some investigators insisted the body belonged to Belle. Others argued the corpse was too small and lacked Belle's identifying features. Over the years, there were countless reported sightings of her across the country. Some believe she escaped with her fortune and lived under a new identity. To this day, her ultimate fate remains unsolved. What is certain, however, is that her Indiana farm became one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. Belle Gunness' story is not just about greed or murder. It's about betrayal in its most horrifying form. She promised love but delivered death. She built a home that should have been a sanctuary, but instead became a graveyard. And whether she died in that fire or lived on under a false name, one truth remains. For the men who trusted her, Belle Gunness was the last face they ever saw. Marriage is supposed to be a vow of devotion, a promise of loyalty through the darkest storms. But for some, the wedding ring is nothing more than a chain they want to break. Not through divorce, but through blood. Few cases demonstrate this chilling truth more clearly than that of Dalia Dippolito, a young Florida wife whose hunger for freedom and wealth turned her into a would-be orchestrator of her husband's murder. In 2009, Dalia Dippolito, a 26-year-old newlywed from Boynton Beach, Florida, seemed to have everything. She was attractive, stylish, and had just married Michael Dippolito, a successful businessman in his late 30s. Michael wasn't perfect. He had a criminal past involving fraud, but he was trying to rebuild his life. He adored Dahlia, showering her with gifts and money, and believed he had found the woman who could help him start fresh. But what Michael saw as devotion, Dahlia saw as an opportunity. To her, his assets were more valuable than his affection. Just months into their marriage, Dahlia grew restless. Michael's past legal troubles restricted some of his finances, and she wasn't satisfied with the lifestyle he could provide. Divorce, however, wasn't an option, not when she could potentially have everything if he were out of the way permanently. So she crafted a sinister solution, hiring a hitman to kill her husband. What Dahlia didn't realize was that her every step would be caught on camera, turning her case into one of the most infamous murder-for-hire plots in American history. Dahlia approached someone she thought was a reliable criminal contact. She asked him if he could help her take care of her husband. The man, alarmed, went straight to police. Working with law enforcement, he pretended to connect her with a professional hitman. In reality, the hitman was an undercover police officer. Over several meetings, recorded on video and audio, Dahlia calmly discussed the details of her husband's murder. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stammer. She looked directly at the man she thought would carry out the killing and told him exactly what she wanted. Michael dead. In one of the most chilling lines ever captured in a murder-for-hire sting, Dahlia said, "I'm not going to change my mind. I'm 5,000% sure I want him dead." The words were delivered with cold certainty. No hesitation. No second thoughts. The police staged a dramatic ruse. On the morning of August 5, 2009, while Dahlia was at the gym, undercover officers pretended to ambush Michael at his home. They informed neighbors that a homicide had occurred. Yellow tape went up. Squad cars pulled in. When Dahlia arrived back, she was met by officers who told her that her husband had been murdered. Her reaction was filmed by hidden cameras, and it shocked even seasoned detectives. Instead of genuine grief, Dahlia put on what appeared to be a rehearsed performance. She screamed, cried, and clutched her face. But detectives who were watching saw something else. An act. Her tears seemed forced, her panic oddly exaggerated, almost as though she was playing a role. Minutes later, she was brought into a police station, not as a widow, but as a suspect. Inside the interrogation room, detectives revealed the truth. They showed Dahlia the footage of her meetings with the undercover hitman. They replayed her own voice, cold, decisive, certain. The mask fell. Confronted with undeniable evidence, Dahlia tried to backpedal. She claimed she had been acting, that she was trying to create content for a reality TV pitch, that it was all just a game. But the excuse was as flimsy as it was bizarre. The police had more than enough proof that her intent was real. Dahlia's trial was a media spectacle. Clips of her telling the undercover officer she was 5,000% sure became viral. The courtroom watched her fake tears at the staged crime scene, replayed again and again for the jury. The prosecution painted her as manipulative, cunning, and utterly cold. They highlighted not only the recordings, but also evidence that she had previously tried to frame her husband for drug possession, in an earlier attempt to get rid of him. Her defense team, scrambling, argued entrapment. They claimed police had gone too far, luring Dahlia into a crime she otherwise wouldn't have committed. But the jury didn't buy it. In 2011, Dahlia Dippolito was convicted of solicitation to commit first-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her case didn't end there. Dahlia appealed, and after years of legal wrangling, her conviction was overturned on procedural grounds. A retrial followed, with the same shocking evidence presented again. In 2017, after her third trial, Dahlia was once again convicted and sentenced, this time to 16 years behind bars. Her story captivated the public not just because of the crime itself, but because of how surreal it seemed. It felt like something out of a crime drama. A beautiful young wife, a staged murder, hidden cameras, and a courtroom where her lies unraveled on replay. Michael Dippolito survived, but not without scars. He described feeling utterly betrayed, not just by the woman he loved, but by the reality that his own wife had looked him in the eyes and plotted his death. For him, the staged murder scene was terrifying, not because he was harmed, but because he realized just how close he had come to being erased. His life had been spared not by Dahlia's conscience, but by the vigilance of law enforcement. The case of Dahlia Dippolito is a chilling reminder of how love can be weaponized, how intimacy can become a blueprint for murder. In her, we see a woman who chose greed and freedom over loyalty, who wore her vows like camouflage while quietly plotting betrayal. When she said she was 5,000% sure, she revealed not only her intent, but her complete lack of humanity. For Michael, devotion nearly cost him his life. For Dahlia, it cost her freedom, and her place in the world she once tried to manipulate.